Whenever you rent or buy a video, you need to be sure that the film you choose is suitable for the audience at home.
Do sit down. We're just about to have some tea.
Ladies and gentlemen, please do not panic, but scream! Scream for your lives!
Hey weirdos, the kettle's boiled. Welcome to Tea for Terror, where we take a favourite horror film and dissect it over a nice cuppa. I'm your host, Andrew Graves, and my guest today is here to tell us that nothing is true and everything's permitted. Welcome, Tim Dry. How you doing, mate?
Well, welcome to you, Andrew.
Well, I'm already here, so I'm I never leave this Tea for Terror dungeon that I'm trapped in forever.
Morning, mate.
This is a film about madness.
No soap on the gentleman's collar.
Madness and sanity.
Where would you like to start? Can I go right back? I mean, I'm going back to 1964 now.
Blimey.
Okay. Yeah,
You've been busy.
It's an interesting journey. My late brother, David, was an architect, okay? A very successful one, back in 62, 63. In 63, he got invited to co-design the interior of the Marquee Club with Angus MacBain when the Marquee Club was in Oxford Street. This is 63. So David co-designed a sort of slightly, it's called the Marquee, so it had a slightly circus kind of vibe going on. And then the Marquee moved to Wardour Street, which is where most of us know and love it, But as a result of his co-designing the interior, David got absolutely lifetime free entry to the Marquee Club, and also to then the Jazz and Blues Festival that were also organized by the Marquee Club by Harold Pendleton. So suddenly in 1964, I'm 12 years old, and David said, look, they got this bloody Jazz and Blues Festival going on over the road from me. Do you want to go along? I go, yes, David, I do. And I did. And topping the bill were the Rolling Stones. Cool, blimey, governor. And second on the bill were the Yardbirds with Eric, So I'm 12 years old. I'm completely and utterly blown away by this, And that was the first time I saw the Stones. The second time was in 1965 at the same festival in Richmond. And then the powers that be said, we don't want these long-haired types, sleeping in our park and snorting up grannies or whatever. And he moved to Windsor, And that was the last thing I saw of the Stones until 1969, when I went to the free concert, along with, 250,000 other kids, But so the connection with the Stones and Mick Jagger, I told you this is going to be convoluted, goes way back. And then it started from there,
So what do you remember about that first time you saw the Stones then?
Well, I think Not Fade Away had come out, so we were kind of used to them doing a kind of Buddy Holly meets Bo Diddley kind of thing. They weren't really being mobbed by them, but in 65, which was the last year the festival was in Richmond, the people were going gaga about them, And I just thought, this is so weird because, the year before, they're just an R&B band who used to play at the Station Hotel in Richmond. And all of a sudden, it's like, oh, okay. Well,
But it kind of, I was born in 1970, so kind of obviously I'm aware of the Stones. I've got some Stone stuff, but I guess from a slightly more outsider's point of view, in terms of how they might have been looked at then, there's always that old thing of like, well, the Beatles were seen as being like satanic, and then until the Rolling Stones came along, and suddenly your parents thought it was all right to be into the Beatles, So they in some ways, I think that John Lennon had his dark side, and I think that the Beatles certainly dabbled in dark stuff. But I think on the surface, the Stones were kind of much seen as being more rebellious in a way.
Yes. Well, yeah, apart from the sort of pissing against the garage wall incident, that kind of cemented them as being bad boys, you know. But really, I mean, Mick was a student at the London School of Economics, you know.
Yeah.
Keith
Yeah,
was
I think, there's always that dichotomy in that they were slightly posher, you know, whereas
but Brian was the wild card because he'd already had something like 4 illegitimate children before the Stones had their first record. It's like, whoa, that's really going, Mick.
That's fucking clumsy, that is.
You know, Bill and Charlie, it's like, yeah, okay, whatever. Yeah, but, you know, so from 12 years old, I was very much aware of the Stones and the Yardbirds and that type of music. I love the Beatles, still do. But there wasn't a lot, I wasn't interested in the Hollies or Jerry and the Pacemakers or, you know, the Swinging Blue Jeans and all that stuff. You know, so there's a whole gap between 1964 until 1969 when I saw the Stones in Hyde Park, and that was another story, if you like, another chapter, you know. Because by then I was 17 and I was smoking a bit of you know what, and I'm in the midst of, I don't know, 250,000 people, they say. And the Stones weren't that good, actually. It was really quite disappointing. They were out of tune, they were under-rehearsed. Brian had just died. Mick does the speech, you know, from Shelley, and it was all a bit... And then one of your things you said was the end of the 60s, Altamont, you know. So in July 69, we had the Stones free concert. You know, the month before we had the Blind Faith free concert, along with Edgar effing Broughton Band, you know, whose only gig was Out Demons Out for 20 minutes. It's like, okay. Donovan usually turned up, but yeah, the Stones in the Park, it seemed to be like the last gasp of some kind of flower power freedom thing, you know. And then months later, you'd read about the awful events of Altamont. You think, whoa. And then Jim Morrison getting nicked and stuff. And you think, oh, well, that's it then. It's over, isn't it? You know? And, yeah, sorry.
No, I think, you know, as I said, you know, I think it's easy to, you know, I blame things like BBC Four and these kind of six musification of the past and how they kind of, they create a very simple narrative because it's easier to sell that way. And so it's usually much messier and much more nuanced than that. But I do think there is something in that, you know, as there is with any sort of, you know, switch from one decade to the next, particularly in the 20th century, there is, you know, the beginning of one decade doesn't naturally feel like another decade. It's usually trailing something from the last decade. And I think there was this from, again, you know, for someone, I was naught in the 1970s, so I didn't experience it such, but for what I understand about it, well, but it does feel, you know, from my interest in terms of films and what was happening, I kind of compare it to that really, because there is this, you know, like you said, the Alice Cooper once said very presciently that you had this kind of the hippie sort of flower power stuff. You've got the Summer of Love in 67, but then by 69, things are on the turn. You've got things like Altamont. You've got kind of much more sort of cynical sort of politics. You've got Vietnam's raging on.
I have to jump in here because, you know, I was far too young. Well, not far too young, but I was too young to be part of the 60s thing. In 66, I was 14 years old. It's like, come on, mate. But by, you know, the end of 69, I didn't think, oh God, the 60s are over, because 1970 I went to art school. You know, it's like, hey, at last, free from school and all that shit. And I went to Glastonbury, you know, in 1971, not to the festival, to actually see the site before I knew about any festivals and stuff. So for me, the 60s were still going on. There was still, everyone had long hair, smoking dope, satins, velvets and stuff like that. It wasn't like there was a sort of door slammed shut and said, right, that's it, mate. 60s over. Now we're into the grim 70s. 70s weren't fucking grim at all. Certainly not in my neck of the woods. And we're talking about suburban Surrey, 40 miles south of London or whatever. It was still, we were all gathering together, exchanging information, in groups, in people's houses. Okay, we smoked a lot of dope, so what? But we would exchange, have you read this book? Have you heard this album? And I remember I'd seen David Bowie with his mime troupe, Feathers, just him and Hutch and Hermione in a pub in Croydon, a couple of years earlier. And I thought, wow, he looks cool. But then suddenly the 70s, the glam thing happened, which sort of distracted people, I think. Suddenly it was like, oh, we can all have fun and dress up again now. But there was quite a sort of intense political thing going on in the 70s with magazines like Oz, IT magazine. The underground was still going on in 70, 71, 72, And Bowie came up through that. He came up through the arts labs in southeast London with his 12-string guitar and his strangely permed hair. Never quite, anyway. But it was still there. It wasn't like, boom, that 60s gone, now we're into whatever. Anyway, there you go.
Yeah, no, I don't think, I'm not trying to suggest it was kind of like this natural end, but I think they're creeping into certainly rock and roll. You got, obviously, like I said, the Beatles were seen as being fairly harmless when the Stones came along, and then you got things like Jim Morrison and the Doors, which were kind of much more extreme and subversive, and then, things like the original Alice Cooper band, and
sure.
As I was saying earlier on, Alice Cooper said, they came along and drove a stake through the heart of the Love generation. And I think what you're saying about that idea of the 60s pervading into the 70s, I think that's, it's natural with any decade. But I think I think a lot of that, again, looking back at this, it feels like that idea of the swinging 60s, that was a lot of that was very London centric. And I think a lot of it didn't really spill out into the provinces and other places and smaller places, right, mining towns, until much later on. Like, you can see that in television as well. A lot of television from the early 70s, when I was kind of first being aware of things, when I was very young, it was very psychedelic. Psychedelia was kind of 65, 66, but it was still spilling into the mid-70s.
It became sort of cute and cuddly. We'd have lots of sort of flashing rainbow colors and people with flares and stuff. But I did wholeheartedly embody the whole hippie thing. That's why I moved to Brighton, which is eventually going to lead me into performance. But it's just that at that time, it was very strange because you're too young to be part of the 60s, but cynical enough to not be part of whatever's coming next. And I've read interviews with people like Susie or Billy Idol or whatever. They say, well, we kind of missed out on the 60s, but now we got this, And I always thought, oh, damn, it's good to be part of a movement, even if it's only a kind of, I don't know. No, I'm not knocking it. To be a kind of newsworthy, the Bromley contingent or, but at least they had something. I was in the middle, so I had to resort to watching movies and reading a lot of books, And that's where, because I was very ill as a child, none of us had TVs back in the 50s, but I was very ill as a child. So I had 6 or 7 weeks in bed, and my only recourse was to read, So I read a whole shitload of stuff quite early on. I'm sort of moving into things that a 9-year-old doesn't quite understand. We're reading about Aldous Huxley or something. And it was only when I started smoking that I suddenly, it all became a bit clearer, that there is more to life than, my suburban bedroom or my suburban town or indeed the UK or indeed the universe, whatever,
I think kind of pre, 21st century, where you're absolutely just bombarded with technology and social media and communication devices, and everybody's talking all at once, all this blah, 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 blah. I think that, and I don't want to sound like an old fart, but it was kind of what I think boredom is really fucking important because that's where interesting stuff happens. That's where
Yeah,
you
sure.
form bands. That's where you create a piece of art. That's where you record a song. That's where you write a poem. Wherever. That's where you make a film. Boredom. And if you're, I think we're being discouraged to ever be bored now. And I think, someone who once worked in a college with younger people. I had no problem with the kids, but the problem I had was with upper management telling you that you had to entertain them constantly. And I'm just like, well, no, you need to leave them be. So you need to leave those spaces where they can
Yeah.
figure things out for themselves. And that's not, I think a lot of schools and a lot of way the education system and what media does, it's just constant. You're not allowed any, no one just sits on a bus anymore and stares out a window. Everybody is engaged with a screen, and there is no room for boredom, and you need it. It's really fucking important.
Well, I think that's what makes certainly my generation more kind of in tune, if you like, is that we had no mobile phones, we had no internet, so it was books, but it was talking. I'd go round to my friends and get stoned of an evening, and we'd talk about Aldous Huxley, we'd talk about Antoninato and the theatre of cruelty, and stuff that was going, whoa, what is this? I'm learning all this info, And it was only, I think it was David Bowie, basically. I didn't like Dylan. I had a big problem with his voice. But his lyrics, fantastic.
Oh,
but
very dare you. I love it.
David Bowie's Hunky Dory, there's one song called Quicksand
Yeah.
on it, when he says, I'm closer to the golden dawn, immersed in Crowley's uniform of imagery. I thought, fucking hell, that's you talking to me. Because he's a suburban Surrey boy like me. And I suddenly thought, right now, he's made it sort of legit. You can be esoteric. You can be thoughtful. You can be not nostalgic, but what's the opposite of nostalgic? Looking forward, forwardly. But you know what I mean? Suddenly he did open a door.
Mm.
And
I think I think a lot of stuff in the 70s, good and bad stuff. I think we were in this country, arguably we were. I hasten to use the word privilege, but we're kind of privileged in that we were still kind of living in that post-war hangover, and it was this kind of thing that we'd won the war, and still now we've never, touch wood, we've never suffered anything like we did in terms of the bombing raids during the war and the Blitz and stuff like that ever since. So we have the privilege of nostalgia. So I think a lot of our culture, particularly in the 70s and 80s, was nostalgic. But then running through that, you had these people like Bowie, and you had these people that were coming and actually grasping onto the future, because Bowie understood, whereas Germany, they'd not got the privilege of that nostalgia. They couldn't look back. They had to look forward. So this is why they come up with something where we've got Slade and they've got Kraftwerk. It's a different mindset. Slade, there's nothing wrong with Slade. I'm not knocking Slade, but it's kind of like that. Let's all get together and have a party at Christmas. It's very different to what Kraftwerk were doing.
of course. But that's why I never listened to Slade or whatever. It was just that moment on that Hunky Dory album that just triggered something in me. I thought, right, you're the man. And I saw him live in May 1972 when he was half in and half out of being Ziggy. So he had the jumpsuit on. His hair was cut short, but it wasn't red. And he didn't have any makeup on, but he did the most blinding fucking live set I've ever seen with the Spiders, And that was in a town hall in Epsom in Surrey. About 300 people. And I remember turning up at the venue and seeing people I knew from art school, and they all had this sort of kind of vibe going on, that we see something that isn't yet, you know. And it's true, he blew my mind. He started off, the sound, there was no support band, it was just the Ode to Joy from Clockwork Orange. And we're sitting in this church hall on wooden seats, it's like, the fuck? And then suddenly, and he comes out and does Hang On to Yourself. It's like, fucking hell. This is like an angel has come down in Epsom in Surrey to sing his songs of darkness and disgrace. And he did. And that was it. I just suddenly thought, right, he's into the same sort of things. He's read Arto, he's read all of these same books and smoked the same dope. And he's a man. He's not like, Andy Scott from The Sweet or something. Bless him. I love their music. But he had a connection, which will eventually lead me into performance, won't it?
Well, yeah, you may be sitting there listening to this and wondering, what on earth are we banging on about? This is a film podcast. We're banging on about 60s and 70s music. But the reason why we're doing that is because the film we've chosen to look at is the 1970 cult film by Nic Roeg and Donald Cammell, Peformance.
Warner Brothers presents Peformance with Mick Jagger. And Mick Jagger. James Fox. And James Fox.
When was the first time you came across this film?
Okay, well, back in 1970, I was a sort of nascent hippie type, reading Oz magazine, IT, and smoking, yes, a fair amount of stuff, And then suddenly there was this advert, Mick Jagger makes a movie. I thought, oh, that's going to be interesting, And then I've actually got this on my desktop. I'm going to read out some of it for you. The movie was shelved for 2 years by Warner Brothers. Then it was finally released in 1970. And IT said, Jagger's sadist movie finally released. Oh, bloody hell. And down, in the sort of sidebar, it says, a heavy, evil film. Don't see it on acid. I mean, fucking hell. I mean, it's like, this is the underground press saying this, right? So obviously, all of us are thinking, fucking hell, I've got to go and see this. And suddenly, it's gone. It's been withdrawn. What? It's Mick Jagger. You can't do that. Yeah, we can. We've done it. We hate it. Fucking bullshit. So, I really I've seen little things in Oz about they've taken a couple of clips out and put it into the Holland Corn Festival or something of Jagger's tackle, and that was it. Nothing all those years. So eventually, 7 years later, it's finally re-released in 1977. So I think I'm going straight to see this. So I went to the Essential Cinema in Wardour Street, nostalgia, and saw it. I just thought, I came out, I thought, this is the best thing I've ever seen in my fucking life. It encapsulates everything in my life in one movie. I mean, not the gangster stuff. And I just became totally obsessed with it because it covered so much ground that most movies never did. The whole ethos about the gangster modus operandi, how these guys work, putting a bit of frighteners out, and all that stuff. And then the whole thing about transformation through drugs, it's like, and music. I just thought, I've got to see this movie every week. And I did. I went to see it every week for 11 weeks. And it became an obsession. And we will go into why. Sorry.
Well, no. I think that because it's weird. Obviously, like you said, it was made and then it was held back for a couple of years. And I think that's one of the most bizarre things about it is that it was made before Altamont or before your kind of Manson murders. And yet, I would argue there isn't a film that actually encapsulates that changing mood and of balancing between one decade and the next better than this film. It's a really prescient thing, even though it wasn't deliberate.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I know so much about the movie. I don't want to be boring, but the Warner Brothers execs, they went to a screening of the first edition of it, and one of the execs' wife threw up at the amount of violence, the whole.
Everyone's a critic.
And they thought, no, fuck it, this is going to incite the youth to rebellion, but this was a year before Altamont, so they hadn't had the whole end of the 60s stuff. And it was just, they wanted Mick Jagger in A Hard Day's Night, basically.
Yeah.
They got something very, very different to that. And the one thing that has always bugged me is that what we have now is the edited version by Frank Masiolo, I think.
Yes, yeah. Well, he wasn't credited in the original film.
No, but the original movie didn't have Mick Jagger spraying the wall black, bloody blah, and all that stuff. So what was the first version like? Nobody's ever seen it. No one's got it. It's just like, damn.
Well, also Brando was very nearly Chaz, wasn't he?
Sorry?
Brando was very nearly Chaz because he was mates with Donald Cammell.
Donald Cammell had approached Brando a couple of times about other movies, and Brando has sort of reluctantly said, this thing he got called The Performers, But can you imagine Brando as some kind of East End? No, not going to happen, is it?
Well, I think the idea was for him. He was an American running away from his.
Yeah.
He wasn't going to play an East End gangster.
No, of course not. The whole thing will be set in America, and it will be ghastly, But I actually got to know David Cammell through mutual friends, and he told me, fair amount of interesting stuff about the whole process of performance, And it's probably well known that Johnny Shannon, who plays Harry Flowers, was the sort of boxing coach at the Thomas à Becket gym where the Crays used to go. And, James Fox was ordered to go there and get sorted out and stuff. It's all instantly convincing, But there's one story, I don't know whether you know about the guy called David Litmanoff.
Oh, yes. Sorry.
He was hired or threatened to be the kind of advisor for the whole first half of the movie, the whole gangster stuff.
Yes.
And he was a dodgy geezer, he was gay, he was Jewish, always a bit of a problem back in then. And he fell out with Ronnie Craig, which is not a good thing.
Never a good career move, is it?
Some guy came up to him in Kensington High Street one day and slashed his face with a razor and goes, "That's from Ronnie." Fucking hell. Anyway, he wrote a book called Jumpin' Jack Flash, which is co-written, it's his autobiography. And one of the opening scenes is David Litmanoff is hanging by his ankles 5 floors up above Kensington High Street, naked, with his head shaved and blood dripping down onto the pavement way below. And, hence, the scene of the performance. But he said, it's fucking brilliant. There's all these Hare Krishna types walking along underneath and I'm dripping blood on them, But the strange thing is that later on in that chapter, he said, I had to find refuge with 2 friends of mine. And it was a Russian artist and his wife, and they lived in Earl's Court. And it transpires that these 2 are the parents of 2 very good friends of mine. So you imagine, doorbell rings, it's fucking David Litmanoff, shaven, naked, bleeding. Can you help me? Let me in. It's such an extraordinary story because he gave the first half of the movie all of that argot, the gangster argot that no one's ever done before. I mean, I don't know what we saw. Maybe the Sweeney we're talking about
Well,
19.
yeah, I mean, this was a couple of years before Get Carter, and
Oh,
obviously
way
10,
before
10,
that.
10 years before sort of Long Good Friday. So yeah,
So all of a sudden, I'm confronted with this underworld that I had no knowledge of, and I just thought, wow, Chaz is like this demon, barely controlled demon that is sort of meting out this justice to people. That's an extraordinary first half. That would make a whole movie on its own, wouldn't it? And David,
yeah. I was going to say, I mean, I love the kind of esoteric stuff that comes later on, the trippy stuff, but I really love that first half of the film. That to me, that first act is just it's so. I mean, it's got that kind of Nic Roeg feel, the way it's kind of cut and paste together, and it's kind of the
yeah,
editing is very strange, but I do love that. It's like you said, you had some stuff beforehand, but I don't think you'd ever had anything quite as grim and brutal as that. In terms of
linguistically violent, apart from physically violent. I mean, the whole thing about shaving the chauffeur's head, well, that's straight out of David Litminoff's real experience. It's like, fucking hell. I mean, you mix with the craze, and then you're, advisor on this movie, which is a gangster on the run, meets up with a faded pop star. It's like, fucking hell, I'm going straight in there. But all of that dialogue.
There's nothing wrong with me. I'm normal.
Right, again. Me. Would you call that equitable?
For me, in some ways, like I said, I like the esoteric stuff, but I really, really love that opening, where we really get to find out about Chaz and his background and who he is and the dodgy people he's employed by or whatever. And all of those, I mean, a lot of those people that you see in that, the sort of criminal gang or enterprise or whatever, they are people that would pop up in stuff again and again and again, sort of over the 70s, and they always kind of played similar roles. They were very much tuned into that. And one of the gang ends up as being kind of, a gangster type in Quadrophenius who Jimmy, they try and blag some speed off, and he ends up selling them paraffin pills instead. So a lot of those people were there, and I guess and there's, you could imagine, as weird and as esoteric it gets towards the end. I think that you could imagine that first act is very real, and it kind of, you could imagine that kind of exists within the same universe as Get Carter and Long Good Friday and all those kind of classic English gangland films. However, we've got the other stuff.
But it was a Mick Jagger vehicle, so you can imagine
Of course.
what the fuck is all this about? Interesting. Johnny Shannon, who plays Harry Flowers, was actually hired as the sort of boxing instructor at the Thomas à Becket gym for James Fox to sort out. And Johnny Bindon, well, he was well known in West London circles as being a bit tasty, you know what I mean? And I've just been reading Marianne Faithfull's wonderful autobiography, Faithful. And she's talking about performance, obviously, because, her boyfriend is heavily involved in it. And she says, well, Mick has got to be a combination of Keith and Brian to play this part. Anyway, she says something about Johnny Bindon that, he cut off a guy's head in a pub and then got life imprisonment. It's like, no, Marianne, sorry. He did cut off some geezer's thumb or finger and had it in the mouth, and he would go up and go, yeah, what? I actually met him at a party, but back in 1982 or something in Chelsea, and I thought, don't make eye contact, because it's like, because I look so extreme in the 1980s, 82, you don't want to lock eyes with Johnny Bindon. But no, all of that stuff, and David Litminoff doing the whole vocal coaching. Sorry, I'd never heard anyone speak this sort of argot in the same sort of way. You know, I mean, in my hometown, there always be geezers hanging out outside the hot dog stand in Red Hall High Street, right? And I remember one funny evening, being a hippie, I was very stoned all the time, right? And I was walking home past the hot dog stand, and this geezer in a sharp suit steps out and goes, "You are a Chad." Sorry. Oh, sorry. What's a Chad? A Chad is an arsehole, you cunt. Now, fuck off. I thought, fucking hell. That was real. You know, so a few years later, Peformance comes out, and I think, bloody hell, yeah, they got that one right. You know, but Johnny Shannon, bless him, it's a strange thing because he plays, you know, Harry Flowers and, you know, controlling his empire. And at the same time, Peter Rackman was controlling his empire in Notting Hill Gate at the same time. And I thought, well, Harry Flowers and Peter Rackman are identical twins, you know. Oh, merging, oh no. And years later, they made a movie about Rackman. And of course, who's going to play him? Johnny Shannon. Hello, Chaz. Brilliant. He's a real geezer, you know. Real geezers can't pronounce their R's properly, you know. Right.
Well, yeah, you know, I think that there's a difference between, I mean, not that I spent much time hanging around like actual 70s gangland people, but I'm kind of from in terms of film performances, I think it's kind of like, you know, your actual sort of geezers, they just don't give a fuck. If you're trying to be something, then you've not quite got it. You know, yeah, Harry Flowers genuinely doesn't give a fuck about anything or anybody. He just does what he does, and that's why he does it. And I like that. But I think that, you know, Chaz, played brilliantly by James Fox. I think he does it. The reason it's such a great character is because, like a little bit like Pinky in Brighton Rock. It's not just about this viciousness or him being an East End sort of gangster type or whatever. He is ever so slightly psychotic. You know, there is something, he's messed up. There's something not quite functioning right in his brain. You know, he's too eager to want to go there and do this violent stuff. Something we know nothing really about his past, but we can only imagine this something's fucked him up. He is, you know, in the same way that, you know, that performance by Richard Attenborough in Brighton Rock is just incredible, because he really ramps up this how psychotic that character is. And I think that is something about Chaz.
That's a very, very good analogy, actually. Because the subtext with Chaz is that he is actually bisexual.
Yeah.
And this sort of is hinted at, but it only comes out later on in the movie when he meets, you know, Michel Breton as a little, French, eh? You know, and that whole thing is not quite, is he or isn't he? And Jagger, obviously, his character zooms in on that, and so does Ferber. But in the end, in the beginning, it's just that I am so fucking macho. I put a bit of stick about, you know. And underneath it all, the way he arranges the items on his coffee table before he goes out to do some mischief, right? It's all very OCD, very kind of, there's something going on in him that isn't, either he's afraid of or he doesn't admit. And so eventually meeting Chaz and the whole denouement, it suddenly comes out. At the end of the movie, he's kind of reborn, you know, as this wonderful character.
You know, touching upon that, you know, you mentioned there the OCD thing, you know, because that is something that's kind of like this repeat. I don't want to sound like all wanky and fucking pretentious, but there is this kind of repeated motif, isn't there? Like, so we get, you know, Chaz's flat is very neat and tidy, you know. But then there's a scene where I think it's Harry Flowers. He puts his knives in a sort of 90-degree angles against his plate, and then later on in the flat, in Turner's flat, we get a similar thing with knives as well. And it's very, very, very much a Rogue thing of having these kind of repeated motifs through it. And obviously, we get the repetition of the earlier scene with Harry Flowers, and they kind of supplant him with Jagger towards the end as well, which is and I'd not noticed how clever that is. It is literally the same scene, and they interact with the same. It's brilliant. It's really well done.
It's very clever. I mean, I've actually got the entire screenplay here. Which was finally, produced a few years back. And it's all there, this sort of repeating of lines like, I know who I am. I'm alive and well. You push the buttons on that thing. Again, later on, it's like, I know who I am. You forgot to phone your agent. Oh, I can't get over it, how fucking brilliant this movie is, And I think a lot of people that watch your wonderful show are probably thinking, well, why is Tim Dry talking about performance? It's not horror. It's not terror, but it is terror. If you think about, the beating that Chaz undergoes by his potentially ex-lover, Joey Maddox, and then, the aftermath of that, and then regrouping himself as, Johnny Dean, the juggler, right? And then the whole end thing when he shoots Jagger in the head, a bit of a giveaway, but it's like this is actually terrifying. It's horrible. I mean, I came out of that movie thinking, I don't know what the fuck I've just watched, because I don't know what I was expecting. I was expecting something like that awful Monkeys movie, The Head, not The Head. Which was them sort of being all wacky and psychedelic and jumping off bridges and slow motion and stuff. But this is like, I've never seen anything like this. What the fuck? And that's what excited me and entranced me into that world, So the very ending of it, when he transforms into Jagger in the car as it pulls off, it's like, that is a real headline. There's no way around it.
Yeah, it's literally like, split second, and we see him as Jagger, and it's just, it's really, and the reason, to go into what you were saying, I would argue, I do this podcast, and I love horror films, and I like traditional horror films, like classic horror films. But to me, horror or terror, whatever you want to call it, it's a very broad church. And I think, this film, in the same way that I would argue that Eraserhead is not really a horror film, but I would definitely do it on this podcast if someone suggested, because it's so like this film, elements of this film, they're so far out on the edge that it shares the same space as horror or terror, because it's so disorientating. It's a mind fuck. That's what this film is, and that's why I think it suits this podcast. So come at me if anybody's got any problem with that. Come at me, but I will look at any film on this podcast. You can justify that it's got horror elements or whatever, then we'll look at it. I'm quite.
I mean, you can say the same thing about David Lynch. I mean, Lost Highway, or Wild at Heart, whatever. There's elements that are beyond our day-to-day understanding, and so therefore that's kind of horrifying, terrifying. I mean, is that one scene, is it in Lost Highway, when the character's in the club, and the guy with a strange sort of white face says, I'm actually in your flat now.
Yes.
It's like, fuck, that's taken me somewhere I didn't want to go. So this movie does the same thing. But obviously, when it came out, I mean, the underground press said it was evil, sadistic, and that's before the mainstream red tops got a hold of it, So that's immediately attractive to people like myself. But we had to wait 7 fucking years for it to come out. And then it came out at these independent cinemas in London, like The Essential, The Electric in Portobello, and it's still got this sort of reputation of being undesirable in some way, a bit, I mean, on one level, you've got Anita Pallenberg naked. Hello. You've got a beautiful Mick Jagger, probably at the height of his sort of beauteousness. And you've got James Fox giving it all this. But still, people thought, nah, it's too weird. I don't get it, you know. One thing, you know, when the Rolling Stones did their sort of rock and roll circus thing, that was done in 1968, December 68, they filmed it. And it was shelved for 40 years or something. But Jagger is very definitely Turner in that. You can see he's still got the dyed black hair. He's wearing a skin tight red top, and he takes the top off, and he's got the devil as a tattoo on his chest. It's like, come on, you are Turner, my son.
But you know, that's the other connection with horror with this film. So, you know, a couple of years later, you're getting things like, well, about a year later, you're getting things like Blood on Satan's Claw, and around the same time that this was made, you're getting things like the Witchfinder General, and then a little bit later, the Wicker Man, and you know, in something like Blood on Satan's Claw, they wear, you know, it does what it says on the tin. This is very obviously about satanic practices, but because they set it, it's a historical sort of costume piece. It disguises the fact that actually what they're really talking about in that film is the generation gap of the late 60s, early 70s, and you know, supplanting this kind of idea of the satanic with the thing that the kids are into that the parents just don't understand. But I think there is something, even though it's not explicit in this, is much more kind of satanic, if you like, but it's kind of below the surface. There is something much more strange at foot, I think, in this film.
Okay, I mean, if somebody had to sum up what is Performance about, I'd say it's the transference of souls. It's that you've got Chaz, who is a performing gangster who enjoys his work, you know, and he's very good at it. And then by circumstance, he ends up in the home of Mick Jagger, who was a performer, who has lost his demon, right? And then in Chaz, he sees the possibility of taking some of his demon, putting it back into him, so he can then become the performer again. That's the essence of the whole movie. I mean, you could say, forget the gangster stuff, forget the whole stuff. But the end point is they do become the same person. And so, deal done. You know, is it a Mephistophelian deal, or is it just shit? Whatever. But the fact that one performer has lost his demon and needs another one to recreate that is an extraordinary concept. And that's, people forget that. They just think, oh, Mick Jagger is being, James Fox is being, you know. But the fundamental thing of the whole movie is the transference of the art of performance. That's why it's called Performance.
Yeah, and I think it's difficult now. Obviously, you know, Rolling Stones are on their 50th kind of comeback tour or whatever, which is fine. Do whatever they want. I'm not knocking it. But I think that, you know, obviously someone like Jagger is going to eventually become a parody of himself, you know, spitting image or whatever, you know. But, you know, this really does remind you what a kind of subversive, disturbing, strange figure he was. I mean, and this is one of his key, well, certainly in terms of, you know, he wasn't necessarily great at acting in other things, but this is essentially who he is. This is kind of like distilling all of those concerns that people had about the Stones into this performance. There is something troubling about this guy, and absolutely appealing as well, you know, as a, you know, watching this in my teens or whatever, you know, this was like, fuck is this?
I mean, Marianne Faithfull, in her autobiography, which I've just finished reading, she says that after Performance, Mick did become Turner. And you can see that he'd adopted all the strengths of that character and negated the weaknesses of that character. But in terms of performance, Mick, from that day on, you know, in 1968 to the tour in 1969 or whatever, he has still got that essence, that sort of, it's not demonic. No, I don't believe in that. but it's a darker element that was never there in the Stones before. They're always the guys who pissed against a wall and wrote sort of jolly, pop song.
Yeah,
All of a sudden,
they went from being sort of long-haired earbuds to being something genuinely subversive, I think,
yeah. And that's down to Mick. It's down to Keith, mainly. I mean, Mick was always a sort of middle-class boy. He didn't want to offend anyone, but suddenly he's in this movie and he's got a free reign to be whoever. Obviously, he does shag Anita Pallenberg and this, that, and the other. And he must have been an extra. It's like Bowie and Man Who Fell to Earth, another Nic Roeg movie.
Yeah.
Where you actually are playing an extension of yourself, I mean, after this, Nic Roeg went on to do, well, he did Walkabout immediately afterwards. That's why he wasn't there for the editing. And then he did Man Who Fell to Earth and everything else, Donald Cammell, bless him, he tried and tried and tried to get more projects off the ground. And eventually he did Demon Seed, which I was going to choose for this, with Julie Christie and a computer. Or it was going to be White of the Eye, which is about a serial killer in the Midwest. But you said, oh, what about Performance? And I thought, yes, going for that one. Because Performance has so many different levels, Demon Seed, okay, it's about a girl impregnated by a computer, husband's out of town, fuck it, go for it. White of the Eye is a very good serial killer movie, and I do love serial killer movies, but it's so kind of Midwest, and he's a guy who installs hi-fis in rich, poor ladies' houses, and it's almost inevitable. There's no big sort of, apart from there's one scene in White of the Eye where his wife confronts him with these bits of body parts hanging underneath.
Yeah.
And she goes, "But who made you do this?" I said, "God." And he says, God is just the middleman. And I just thought, fucking hell, that is the best line I've ever heard, And then the movie gets really silly when he blows himself up in the quarry with, But no, Performance is the one that I always come back to as most people I talk to about it just don't get it. It's like, well,
I think, because we can balloon on about all its kind of strangeness, which is great. But I think it also, there's a lot of humor in it. On the edges, and it's very sort of, this is the kind of film that could only have been made in Britain. I think this would not have translated into the States. It just would, if you'd have taken the same characters and make them American, it might have been interesting, but it wouldn't be the same because it's that Englishness. It is similar to what me and Barbie were talking about before, but it is this, and it's that English eccentricity. The fact that this kid's floating around Turner's flat, and she's eating beans in the kitchen and stuff, and all that kind of stuff. It's brilliant. It's like what a great little detail that is, and the banter between the crooks as well. And I love it. It makes me laugh, even though it's not. It's kind of a tragic scene because he's going to get it, but the scene where the gangsters find him eventually and they arrive, and he's coming downstairs and he's just dressed in the wig, and you're thinking. It's always like they're looking, they don't say anything, but it's like, what the fuck have you been doing?
He goes, "No, Rosie, I've got to pop upstairs for a moment." And he shows the gun in his waistband. And Rosie said, "All right, make it 5 minutes, but you let me have the shooter as soon as you come down." Then he goes up into Turner's bedroom, and then the music starts. And the music, let's go on to that one next. But he's in there, and it's Jagger and Ferber. And he goes, "Oh, I've got to shoot off now." Shoot off. Ooh. And Jagger says, "No, I want to talk to you some more." Chaz says, "You don't know where I'm going, pal." Jagger says, "I do." And he puts his head down as Chaz cocks the gun. He goes, "I don't." He shoots some bits. And in comes the broken glass, Borges. That wonderful fucking music by the.
And then we actually go into the head wound as well, which is great.
You go right in there, Chaz, and root around a bit. You know what I mean? I mean, everything is layers. It is Borges. It is everything I read about in the 70s is happening in this movie. That one scene connects to another scene, maybe an hour later. You know, it's just like Jesus. But the soundtrack, okay. I think for me personally, it's the best soundtrack I've ever heard of any movie that is consistent of different tracks. It's not just one. It's not like the soundtrack to Gladiator, which is brilliant, but it's it's Hans Zimmer and Lisa Gerrard all the way. But this is you've got Ry Cooder playing an amazing slide guitar. You've got the the black girl singers. What are they called? Staple singers? Sorry. Randy Newman, his title song, which starts the movie off, Gone Dead Train. And you hear that, you think, the fuck is this? And it intercuts between this black roller going through the countryside to Chaz, having a good old whatever. And it recurs again at the end of the movie. It was only a few years ago, I thought, what are the lyrics of this song? Gone Dead Train by Randy Newman. And it's unbelievable. It's all about a man who's desperate to sort of come, but can't because he's living above a gone dead train. It's like, Jesus, it's all about shoot and supply from the devil's eye. And what's it? It's like, what the fuck is that about? So that's the start and the end of the movie, right? And then right in the middle, you've got Jagger doing Memo from Turner, which lyrically, again, is unbelievable. Didn't I see you down in San Antone?
Yeah.
Oh, you drowned that Jew in Rampton as he washed his sleeveless shirt. It's like, fuck's sake. But, the Stones did a version of that later when Keith had forgiven him. And it's awful. But the version in the movie is Ry Cooder and Jack Nitch. And it's a fantastic fucking song. It really is, and that again adds another element of darkness to it. I mean, these are not jolly lyrics.
Yeah, I mean the other thing about this film that I know, I've not even got. I'm into kind of Blu-ray and like updating and cleaning things up, but I've not got like a Blu-ray version of this film. I've just got the old DVD, and I just stuck that in. But what I note, even this is not a super cleaned up version at all, but even so, it looks incredible. And as much as I kind of like that late 60s, early 70s grottiness of a lot of those films from that era, that's kind, other than sort of Turner's Kitchen, which is a bit kind of messy and all over the place, it's got a kind of sheen to it. It's got some kind of graininess, but it's brilliantly lit. The cinematography is fantastic.
Yeah, well, that's Nic Roeg, isn't it?
Yeah.
How he met Donald Cammell, I don't know. I actually got to meet and get to know David Cammell through friends a few years back, and he told me a few things about the filming of Peformance. And they found this sort of flat in Lowndes Square and owned by this sort of strange sort of naval guy called Captain Plug or something. And they had the basement and they had the ground floor, but all the exteriors were done in Power Square, 81 Power Square. You can come here. But it just, again, the choice of Power Square. Because in 1968, it was still Ratman land. It was still very West Indian immigrants with downtrodden. Why would some failed pop star live in a mansion in this area? Why isn't it in Chelsea or Knightsbridge or, He had 3 number 1s, 3 number 2s, and a number 4.
That's a brilliant little kid. That's fantastic. With their beans.
Oh God, sorry, I do gush, but it is one of my most favorite movies of all time, and it's been a pleasure to talk about it. I'm sure there's a lot more I could go into, but I won't. But I just strongly recommend people. You think, oh, it's not horror, oh, it's not blah blah. It has all those elements in it. You know,
Yeah.
when Chaz gets beaten and he's tied down, and they're trying to get him to say, "I am a Puff," and they've written it on the wall, "Puff," in blood or red paint. He goes, "I am," and he goes out. He's gone. You know, and then he wakes up and he shoots Joey Maddox in the head, and he goes, "I am a bullet."
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
fucking hell. You know, it's like, this is not the Sweeney. This is not jolly stuff. This is dark from the get-go, really. You know, you see Chaz doing his job as a performer, right? But it's also the disintegration of a character. I've never seen that before. You know, because my previous viewing of James Fox was in The Servant, you know, where he's the upper class, you know, la-di-da. And, you know, Dirk Bogarde is the servant who's manipulating him into some nefarious things. But James Fox is Chaz. He really is Chaz. You know,
Yeah,
thank you.
He's brilliant. He's brilliant.
You
So, have you got any plugs, Tim? Anything coming up?
I don't have anything new. I mean, my autobiography, Falling Upwards, Scenes from a Life, is still out there. And my novella, Ricochet, is still out there. That's about it, really.
Okay. Well, we'll make sure we put them on the links when I put the episode out.
Thank you.
So, yeah, it just remains for me to say thanks for coming on, Tim. It's been a real pleasure once again. Really good to talk about performance.
I'm really sorry that I tend to ramble and shoot off and whatever.
No, ramble is our game. This is what we're here to do. I wouldn't have a podcast if I didn't want people to go on a ramble, would I? Come on. So rambling's fine with me. I'm good at rambling myself. Yeah. So thanks, Tim. Thanks for coming on. It's been an absolute, always a pleasure, never a chore. So remember to call round next time. Make yourself at home. You look like you're dying for a nice cup of tea for terror.
And remember, my friend, future events such as these will affect you in the future.